Ladies and gentlemen, if I can ask you to take your seats, please. Could I ask everyone to take their seats, please? Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in London at another London Climate Action Week. But I think that as I open today as the first moderator of this incredible session for Nature Positive for a Net Zero Future, I'd like to say a few words about how we walk the talk and leave this room so that we have no more pledges, but actually real action. I am the co-president of the Club of Rome, and I say that with great trepidation because actually this is the 50th anniversary of the Limits to Growth, the first seminal report that actually talks about the fact that we had to limit our growth and that we needed to live within finite planetary boundaries. And I come to you dressed as well with a beautiful necklace that I actually received by the Indigenous people that were watching us in Glasgow when so many leaders, which I had the pleasure of moderating at the Leaders Summit, made some very important pledges around the need to support Indigenous people, the need to stop deforestation, the need to remember our sense of responsibility to those that are actually keeping our lungs alive. This session is a reminder of that, and that is why I carry this with me. An incredible Indigenous woman that had traveled to make sure that her voice was heard. I'm also wearing fully plant-based shoes because I decided that instead of changing my tennis shoes today into my nice pumps, I would walk the talk and wear sneakers that are 100% plant-based to demonstrate once again, we don't need forest commodities. We don't need to deforest for commodities that are destroying acres and acres of land. Nature is our life source. And we have to place a value on nature. And we have to do it now. So my pledge today is that I will walk the talk when I leave here. And I hope that you as well, as financiers, as government officials, as civil society, will not come to another London Climate Action Week or another meeting like this, where once again we talk about the problem. Because the problem is grave. Last week, again, Indigenous people have been slaughtered because they are trying to protect the Amazon forest, and Bolsonaro has said, go, go, go. Miners, cattle ranchers, rubber tappers. It's time to stop this. So this session is going to be about walking the talk. This session is going to be around how forests play a crucial role. We know the feedback loops between nature and climate change. We understand that nature, and in particular, forests, are 1/3 of the solution to ensure that we meet our 1.5 degree target. And remember, people, we're at 1.2. After 2 decades of scientific research and 50 years since the Limits to Growth, let's remember that this is the moment. This is the decisive decade. That is why we are here in the race to resilience and the race to net zero, to ensure that we actually do make a difference. That commitments such as the Leaders Pledge for Nature, that the NDCs are actually fully integrated with nature-based solutions, that more FIs and corporations pledge to stop deforestation, to ensure that commodities are not actually traded, which harm nature. Today, 35 financial institutions have committed to tackling agricultural commodity-driven deforestation by 2025. We need more. That is what we need. We're making progress in some areas, but really, people, I'm here to tell you, and I know that Decisively will say the same. While we sit here, those that are protecting our lungs are getting increasingly under danger and being eliminated. Our Planetary Emergency Plan, which brought together 350 partners, has also indicated very clearly the targets and the timetables that are necessary, as well as our recall to action. The recall to action, which is saying, let's stop with more pledges necessarily. Let's ensure that we implement what we already have. And let's not let short-term crises that are a symptom of the systemic breakdown that we have in our society, continue to stop us from doing what we need to do in terms of protecting our forests. Yes, food is important now as we face the crunch, as is energy. But let's make sure that when we actually pull out of fossil energy, when we actually look at our food production, that nature is full center part of the solution. So I want to move on now to our session. And I hope that we truly will not only talk, but walk the talk as we move through this morning's sessions. Let me start by introducing Lord Benyon, who will be with us here today. The Right Honourable Lord Richard Benyon, there you are. James, I think you're going to have to move out of the way so we can get through. Was appointed Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. Very important mover and shaker in terms of the Leaders' Pledge that we saw. I will ask you to sit here if you may. And I will also ask Chai Souris to join Lord Benyon. Chai is the founder and coordinator of the Movement of Indigenous Youth of Rodonia, working with a Canide legal team preserving the rights and lands of Indigenous tribes. And what I want to start off with, Chai, you can sit right there, is to ask Your Honor, Lord Benyon, we would like to welcome your opening remarks, in particular regarding nature-based solutions and the importance of tackling deforestation in the context of climate action, and in particular because you showed leadership on these issues so prominently at Glasgow.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And this is incredibly important. I was in the House of Commons. I'm now in the House of Lords. I've been a parliamentarian for a long time. When you talk to an audience about carbon, they sort of get it now. But it's about talking today about nature. And it's the other side of the same coin. And we have to get this message across. And it's not just the job of government. This is about you. This is about the leadership we're seeing in this room, the leadership we're seeing in the corporate world. And we want to see that replicated because the evidence tells us there is no credible way of tackling climate change without addressing nature loss. Nature offers up to a third of climate mitigation potential in helping us to adapt to temperature rises. Protection and restoration of nature is also critical if we're to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, improve water quality, and clean our air. For too long, we've seen nature protection as a cost to business. The truth is that business relies on nature. Half of our GDP, $44 trillion, relies on the services nature provides. And we need to value them. In England, we are unlocking new markets for nature, aiming to stimulate at least £500 million of private finance a year, rising to £1 billion by the end of the decade, into nature recovery projects. We are setting out clear market rules and standards to bring confidence and to drive out greenwash. And we have a public-private impact fund to invest in nature products. And we're working with the financial sector to unlock barriers for increased investment in nature-based solutions. And more countries are taking this approach globally, delivering jobs and economic opportunity for some of the poorest communities in the world. Forests exemplify both these opportunities and the challenges of our nature economy. Deforestation accounts for 11% of global emissions annually. That's the equivalent of India's total annual emissions. There is no pathway to net zero without tackling deforestation. And 1 billion people depend on forests for their livelihood, and one of them is sitting next to me here. And we have to keep people like her in mind when we are thinking of sometimes the high level discussions that we have about finance. It's actually about people. It's about our very survival as well. And forests are also at the forefront of a new nature economy, high integrity carbon markets that have the potential to unlock billions of dollars of finance, benefiting billions and millions of people while delivering vital environmental benefits. Growing demand for sustainably produced commodities is driving innovation to increase productivity on existing cleared land, reducing pressure on land use conservation. That's why, as COP26 president, we put forests at the heart of our climate change agenda. Over 140 governments signed the Glasgow Leaders Declaration committing to end forest loss and land degradation by 2030. The person behind that is my colleague Zach Goldsmith, who is at the World Ocean Summit, and he sends his best wishes to you today. So let me conclude. Delivering on this commitment means mobilizing more finance for forests and aligning existing private sector financial flows with this goal. This means ensuring the tools we use to manage climate risk fully reflect the risk associated with nature loss. It also means sustaining progress being made by the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. It's great to see the financial sector here taking real leadership and real action. And I'm delighted that GFANZ has included deforestation in its consultation on transition plans, reflecting the importance of forests in tackling climate change. Over 30 financial institutions with $8.7 trillion of assets under management have committed to eliminating deforestation from their portfolios by 2025. And that includes many of you here today, and I'd like to urge others who haven't yet signed up to this to join them. Finance is at the heart of delivering a low-carbon, nature-positive future. Unlocking that finance requires strong collaboration between us all, and I look forward to working with you on this vital agenda.
Thank you so much, Lord Benyon. 8.7 trillion in assets. Let's hike that up. Let's start to talk about how we can bring more assets together in order to ensure that we don't continue towards deforestation. Could I ask Chai, as a representative of many more who are on the front lines, as we've indicated, and who has probably really seen this head on, can you give us a bit of your own personal perspective as to what you see right now in terms of deforestation?
Dom Phillips, Bruno Pereira, Ari Urubuauau, Paulino Guajajara, Zizico Guajajara, Irmã Dorothy. I could use all the time I have here to mention the names of those who were killed for loving and protect the Amazon. I'm Chai Surui, an indigenous activist from the Paité Surui people. I hope my name will never join this tragic list that's been growing so bad, especially in the past few years. Unfortunately, that's a really hard mission, once my family has already received so many death threats. Switzerland has just promised to stop illegal gold imports from Brazilian indigenous land. This is good, but not enough. This use them as an example, but also follow the blood trail of deforestation, invasion, and killings. You will find meat, soya, diamonds, and timber too. European companies, corporations, governments, and citizens must stop supporting and funding our genocide, and you should support our fight. We need a deforestation-free supply chain that also respects human rights. We need sustainable development for everybody. Do European countries want to get rid of oil dependency or use it as an excuse to continue exploring and colonizing countries for the global south. If you think our bodies are the only ones losing life, you are wrong. By keeping the selfish and individualistic and destructive system, you are also killing our Mother Earth. Please remember that there is no thing that's worth more than gold and money. It's life. So is that I think about deforestation. It's more it's not only about the trees, it's about our life. And we, the indigenous people, we are suffering right now while we are here. And you can just pretend that you are not part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Chai. Forests are the lifeblood of so many, and you've said it so clearly. We have to stop our unholy alliances. We can see it on the border with Russia in terms of an unholy alliance. We can see our colonial past, and you are absolutely right that it touches all of us, and it's about life and not just about the trees, although they are part of our life as well. I would like to turn to someone who truly understands the boundaries of nature. Jan Rockstrom couldn't be with us today, but he has actually sent us a short video. The work that we have done ourselves, the Club of Rome with Jan Rockstrom, spans 3 years of working on planetary emergency targets and timetables, but also now Earth for All, where we're very clearly looking at how we can look at systems dynamic modeling to enable us to protect Indigenous people, to protect the forests, but also to ensure that we no longer have poverty and inequality, which drives that thirst for destruction. So can we allow for the video, please, to play? You all know Johan Rockstrom, co-director of the Potsdam Institute.
Dear colleagues and friends, great to be with you here. This is to give you the scientific update on why action on climate change requires also investments in a massive scale in nature positive, which includes multiple benefits for biodiversity, climate stability, and the planetary resilience. We are today in the midst of the Anthropocene, a geological epoch where we are now the dominating force of change on the entire planet. We know that this is playing out today in 4 integrated crises. We're all talking about the climate crisis. We're in the tail end, hopefully, of a COVID-19 crisis, a pandemic that originates from unsustainable exploitation of natural habitats with a zoonosis that spills over from wildlife via domestic animals to humans. We have the Ukraine geopolitical instability in the world, but we're also having the ecological crisis. And this is a crisis today of massive scale. We're in the 6th mass extinction of species. The Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services concludes the drama. We are at risk of losing 1 million of 8 million known species. 70% of the populations of animals and species around the world have been lost just in 1 generation since 1970. We are undermining the functions in the Earth system that can provide good lives, well-being, and development for humanity. The data is all out there in terms of, the 41% loss of insects just over the past few decades, 22% of vertebrate species, and there's so much science that shows the red curves of decline in the populations and in the living species that builds up all the ecosystems in the world. And the pace is unprecedented. We are at 100 to 1,000 times faster in loss of species in the world than the natural background rate. I mean, you've all heard of when the dinosaurs disappeared on planet Earth due to an asteroid collision with planet Earth. We are, for amphibians, for example, losing species over 100 times faster than that Cretaceous max extinction event 66 million years ago. So big things are happening, and big things are happening on a planet that we all depend on in its basic stability. This is showing the last 12,000 years of stability on Earth, which is the Holocene, a plus minus 0.5 degrees Celsius deviation from the pre-industrial average temperature, all thanks to the way nature has been building and buffering the capacity to avoid that the planet deviates away from stable conditions. The pathway forward is known. This is IPCC pathway for a safe landing at 1.5. We need to phase out fossil fuels. You see it in the dark gray line here, to a net zero world economy by 2050. But my key message is this: all models that takes us to a safe landing assume that nature will continue to be this healthy provider of carbon sinks and ecosystem services for humanity. These are the dark green line and light green line you see below the zero line, to be able to provide the buffering capacity for the future. We showed quite recently that if it hadn't been for nature on land, we would have already have crashed through 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, a place we haven't been in for the past 3 million years. So this is really serious. We need a planetary boundary framework to guide humanity's development. In 2015, we concluded that 4 of the 9 boundaries are outside of the safe space, biodiversity being one of them, but also climate, but also on overloading of nitrogen and phosphorus, and land system expansion. We're cutting down too much of intact forest systems on planet Earth. So we're undermining the resilience of the planet exactly when we need a healthy planet more than ever. The latest update we're working on right now shows, unfortunately, that we're in the red also on fresh water and chemical pollution. So unfortunately, we haven't turned things around yet. But nature-based solutions can be the turning point. And it's a turning point that has to be an additionality. It has to be done in terms of what is now developing into the nature positive agenda of halting loss of nature from, we suggest scientifically, a reference point of 2020 onwards. We will continue losing some nature, but we have to reach a net positive point by 2030, which can be done with restoration and regenerative investments across all sectors, from forestry, agriculture to conservation of nature, to restore all systems by 2050. So that's our charge. But it cannot be offset against our inability of landing safely on a fossil fuel-free energy system. It has to be done additional. So what you see to the left here is this suggestion of having science-based targets for climate, net zero by 2050, science-based target for nature, net zero loss from 2020 onwards, and this can give us the integrated pathways to a safe landing by mid-century, where we can keep the Earth system within a stable condition. Because it's come to this. We are risking the planet. The Earth system is now subject to a larger stress than we've ever experienced before. And unfortunately, the only way to really have a safe landing is that we now can buffer the radiative forcing caused by global warming with healthy nature to help us in a future within a safe operating space on Earth. And this is the task now, and that is why nature-based solutions is so important as an equal investment on the climate transition. So with that, good luck in your endeavors on that transition. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Johan. As always, great wisdom on the planetary boundaries. And I'm going to ask Chai and Lord Benyon to take your seats. And thank you very much for joining me in this opening session that truly was going to set the scene. And I hope we've done that in terms of the gravity of the situation. Because what we want to do now is move into how can we truly align financial flows with Paris. And I'd like Nick to join me here. Nick Robbins, where are you? There you are. How are we going to not only align financial flows, but increase investments in nature-based solutions? And then our last section of today, and actually Eva will replace me for that section, is how are we going to turn pledges into practice? What does that look like? Not only in terms of the net zero targets, but making sure that we've got the deforestation targets and the tools in order to enable us to get there. And the corporations and the financial sector underpinning that shift, again, for this decisive decade. So Nick, it's a pleasure to have you next to me. Thank you for joining. Nick is professor in practice for sustainable finance at the LSE's Grantham Research Institute and has been working in this field for so long, and a dear friend. So please, Nick, give us some of your words of wisdom.
We will first have.
Oh, yes, apologies. We will have first Dr. Majun, and then we will actually listen to Nick's wisdom.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me to join this important event and say a few words on how central banks and supervisors are moving forward with biodiversity. As many of you know, the Central Banks and Supervisors Network on Greening the Financial System, or NGFS, was formed in 2017 to enhance the role of the financial system to manage risks and mobilize capital for the global green agenda. The NGFS started with only 8 members in 2017, and now it has 116 members and 19 observers from across 5 continents, including from China, the UK, and Egypt. The NGFS launched a joint study group with Inspire on biodiversity and financial stability in early last year, which I had the pleasure to co-chair with Professor Nick Robbins. After 1 year of study, this group came up with a 100-page report in March this year, stating that the biodiversity loss is a source of financial stability risk, and dealing with biodiversity-related risks is part of central banks and supervisors' mandate. This message was from the study group, but it's now endorsed by the NGFS, representing 100 plus central banks and supervisors in the NGFS statement. The implication of this finding is profound. It is the beginning of a multi-year process during which many central banks and supervisors will introduce regulatory measures to require financial institutions to measure the impact of the investments on nature and biodiversity, to assess how biodiversity loss may cause risks for the financial institutions and financial system, and to disclose nature-related information and to take actions to protect nature and biodiversity and minimize risks arising from biodiversity losses. The theoretical foundation of our conclusion is that 50% of global economic activities are heavily or moderately dependent on biodiversity, and therefore biodiversity loss could have significant economic and financial consequences. Similar to climate change, the decline of ecosystem service poses physical risks to the economic sector and poses transition risks when policies are designed and implemented to halt biodiversity loss. Central banks and financial institutions could support governments' effort to reverse biodiversity loss within the remit of their mandates. I'm glad that the NGFS now has officially launched a biodiversity task force to address the related methodology and regulatory issues. Let me now also share with you some quick points on what China is doing in the space of green finance and biodiversity. Our banking regulator in China now requires banks to assess and disclose the impacts of their lending and investment activities on biodiversity. The People's Bank of China, or the central bank in China, have produced this green loan and green bond taxonomy. And this taxonomy includes nature positive projects. And based on this list, some incentive were given to the financing of these projects. For example, interest subsidies were given to loans for most forestry projects in China. But institutions are also making a lot of innovative attempts on nature-related risk and biodiversity protection. For example, Bank of China recently issued a biodiversity bond, and ICBC is leading a work stream under the China Green Finance Committee to develop relevant tools and methodologies to identify and measure potential risks related to biodiversity. As we look to COP27 and beyond, I expect more innovations from central bank supervisors and financial institutions to address biodiversity-related risks and devote more resources to protect nature and biodiversity. Thank you very much, and I wish today's event a great success. Good morning and good afternoon.
Oh, okay. So I've just been told that we're running over 10 minutes, but the problem is, how do you stop a video in midway? So Nick, can you build on Majum's wisdom, and in particular, these issues that he's brought up so fundamentally, and the realization of nature-related risk, the way in which biodiversity now is being integrated into taxonomy structures, although having sat on the taxonomy in Europe, I'm slightly disappointed in terms of nuclear and oil, of course, first, gas. But this shows that we're starting to think about the financial stability risk in terms of the loss of biodiversity. How can we continue to evolve?
Well, Sandrine, thanks very much. And it's great to be with you today at this really important event about how we connect the nature positive and net zero agendas. I think the main thing is that our financial systems are really embedded in nature, and we need to hold a financial system response to biodiversity loss and nature-related risks. And this is why the report that Marjan has just mentioned of the study group, NGFS and Inspired Study Group, was called Central Banking and Supervision in the Biosphere. We are embedded, and we need all the world's $400 trillion in assets, all of them, to be aligned with the goals of nature-positive net zero economy. I'd like to build on Dr. Ma's remarks and give you a little bit more detail on the role of central banks and supervisors, and make two key points. First, from a financial stability perspective, we concluded in our work that addressing nature and biodiversity related financial risks falls squarely within the mandates of central banks and financial supervisors. It is not outside their day job. Second, also from a capital mobilization perspective, central banks and supervisors can also play a key role in building the necessary financial architecture, which comes to some of the points, Sandrine, you were talking about. So where does central banks and supervisors fit in? Clearly, it is governments that have the primary role in providing the policy frameworks to align financial flows with a net zero and nature positive agenda. But central banks and supervisors can play a really important complementary role to protect financial stability by reducing nature and biodiversity related financial risk and helping to guide financial resources to nature positive activities. In the study group that we've mentioned, the study group on biodiversity loss and financial stability, we found a really positive trend with a growing number of central banks from across the world, north and south, extending their focus from the energy transition to the nature transition. We are working with about 25 central banks. A core finding was that we need an integrated approach to climate and nature-related risks to deal with the powerful linkages, seen most powerfully, as we've already heard today, in the deforestation and land use space, which is not just a major source of greenhouse gas emissions and a major driver of biodiversity loss, but a real threat to financial stability. And what is important is the work we've done. We were a study group, we produced a report, but it's led to real action with the Network for a Green Financial System, setting up a task force to mainstream nature-related risk across all its activities for more than 100 central banks and supervisors around the world. So I just want to touch on some of the actions that central banks are already taking and could take more. And these are about signaling, building capacity, assessing exposure, supervising, and mobilizing. So firstly, signaling. It's very important that central bank supervisors signal to the markets, to the banks, the insurers, the investors they supervise, that biodiversity loss and nature-related risks are part of their plan for greening the financial system and develop a response strategy. And as I say, this is now being done within the NGFS for more than 100 central banks. Second is scaling up capacity. Nature positive economy is really important, but there's a real issue of skills and capacity, and building capacity is particularly important in developing and emerging economies. Assessing exposure. We already have a number of central banks, Brazil, France, Malaysia, Mexico, and the Netherlands, who have been assessing the exposure of their financial systems. And looking ahead, we need to have proper scenarios and stress tests which are measuring the exposure to nature-related and climate risks. We also need the fourth issue, central banks to be supervising regulated firms, to include this in the way that the banks and investors and insurers are looking at their strategy, their governance, their risk and disclosure. And it's really good to see a number of central banks involved in the TNFD, which the minister mentioned earlier, including the Bank of England and the Financial Services Agency of Japan. And finally, mobilizing. The primary function of central banks and supervisors is about financial stability, but they can play a key role in building the financial architecture we need as a whole to mobilize investment for a nature positive economy. Monetary policy is a key tool. We need clear taxonomies, and central banks and supervisors can also walk the talk by making sure that their portfolios also have nature and biodiversity embedded. I'd just like to close really again stressing the point around deforestation. It's very clear that ending deforestation is not just critical for net zero, absolutely essential there, absolutely essential to end deforestation to protect and restore nature, but it's ending deforestation. It's also critical to maintain financial stability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was quite a whirlwind tour, and I think that thank you, because you really unpacked a lot in 5 minutes. I would like now to ask the rest of the panel to actually join me in this fireside chat that we're going to have. And thank you, Nick, for joining me and also for speaking about the important role of central banks. Justin, can I ask you to come and join me? And all of you, Mary Shapiro will actually be joining via link, and Eugenie, Jan Eric, and Jose Pugas. Wonderful. Due to the limited amount of time, let's start with you, Justin. These are very tight. Okay.
This is the fire.
This is good. This is cozy. Okay. So there's no capital on a dead planet. There are no jobs on a dead planet. We just heard from actually Mayun that 50% of our economic activities are dependent on biodiversity. And what we want to do now is really look at net zero, nature positive future from a financial angle. And my question to you now, Justin, from the generation perspective and all of your work that you've been doing in this area, how is a leading financial institution on climate action really going to achieve net zero emissions by 2040? What do we need?
So, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Sandrine. It's great to be here. I think it's already been said that forests are really this critical bridge between existing net zero commitments that $133 trillion of asset managers have made, or asset owners and asset managers have made, and yet only 8.7 trillion is focused on the forest agenda. You cannot achieve net zero without looking at the land use and the deforestation aspect. So that's the first point to make. And it creates this crucial bridge. When we talk about nature positive, it creates this crucial bridge to some of the other things that we heard Lord Benyon and others talk about in terms of how many other ways we're going to need to be looking at our impacts on broader nature. But right now, with everybody counting carbon, the forest and land use agenda is integral to how we make the carbon maths work. So for each and every financial institution, and that includes banks, who right now have not been stepping up into this agenda, but it includes all the financial institutions, we have to understand what exposure we have in our portfolios. And so the first thing is to understand that, to measure that, and to start to then think about how we engage or disengage with the companies that are still driving deforestation or still have that exposure there. So Generation is delighted to have been one of the signatories of the declaration that the high-level champions who've done such a great job of mobilizing private sector. We're delighted to be one of the signatories, but we need to see many more financial institutions join this and engage on this critical topic. And I think the important thing to say is it's not an option. It's something everybody is going to have to do, but it's also something that we can make real progress on. Right? We've had more than a decade of working on this agenda. You've got leading companies called out in the report that was referenced earlier, Nestle, Unilever in the room, that are already moving. We need more companies to emulating what the leaders are doing today. And we need more capital to be flowing to leaders and less capital flowing to laggards. There are also then huge opportunities of how we can start to invest in more innovative nature positive opportunities. And that's also something Generation and many others are starting to look at. But it's like you can't, in the energy space, you can't get the energy transition simply by investing in renewables. You've also got to stop investing in coal. Okay, so for any investors who think, oh, we're just going to jump on the carbon bandwagon, we're going to do nature positive without looking at the exposure of what's driving nature negative activity today, they're kidding themselves. So that's
Absolutely.
where we have to make the changes.
The feedback loops are huge, and I want to turn to you now, Jan-Erik. You are actually CEO of Storband Asset Management, and what committed you as well? What drove you to join some of these commitments in Glasgow, and how are you moving forward?
Well, thank you, and happy to be here on such an important topic. Well, it's been said already by Lon Banyan and many, there's no way to reach net zero without nature. Marjorie highlighted biodiversity is key for business development and economic growth. So as a financial institutions, there's no way we can reach our financial ambitions and achieve the long-term returns without safeguarding nature. Another key message is of course, the need for cooperation. I mean, finance, yes, it's key, but corporates are key, and not the least governments. And I think we need to see more interaction and more coordinated efforts between the three key stakeholders. And we talk a lot about climate, we talk a lot about business, but I think Chai also highlighted the very important people dimension in this issue. So this alliance is very important to us. We, of course, are the signature of the alliance. We encourage more to join. We are taking specific steps and have developed a deforestation policy. We have committed 50%, 15 of our total assets to climate and including nature positive solutions. We are planning and engaging with the 50 companies with the highest deforestation risk. We have an initiative relative vis-a-vis governments called IPDD, which is engaging with both the Brazilian government, Indonesian government, and even the EU in terms of deforestation-free commodity value chains. And I know Danny and Graham, which is part of the initiative in Brazil, are in the room. To top it all, we also now have launched a similar initiative to the Climate Action 100 Plus called Nature 100 Plus. I think the difference is we're not only engaging with corporates, but also with governments. So I encourage many more to join the alliance. And as Justin was saying, looking at the commitments to net zero, it's mind-boggling that it's only 8.7 trillion, even though that's a lot of money as well.
Thank you. So we need to up the bar on the 8.7 trillion. Absolutely. We need more innovative finance as well. We need to make sure we bring in cooperation and corporations. And as you say, now we've got Nature 100 Plus. We need to make it real. And so, Eugenie, I'm going to turn to you because what a title, Earth Pillar Lead at Aviva. I mean, I'd love to have that title. I'm the Doomsday Club with the Club of Rome. You're the Earth Pillar Lead. How is Aviva involved? You also have signed a commitment for 2040. What exactly do you feel is so important right now? Yes.
We have a net zero commitment, and we also signed this commitment to eliminate deforestation. And we did that because we've been working on deforestation for many, many years, engaging with companies, and we weren't seeing enough progress fast enough. And so what we wanted to do was catalyze faster, stronger action, and believe that by joining this initiative, we can do that both internally by getting more resources focused on this and really understanding where our portfolio has impacts on deforestation and how we can stop that. We've seen that hundreds of companies in 2010 signing a commitment to eliminate deforestation by 2020, and not a single one succeeded. So we are not getting anywhere fast enough. And I hope that by signing this and having the roughly 250 billion pounds worth of assets that Aviva has focused on this issue, that we can achieve things faster and much more deeply.
Thank you. Oh, I need to turn this on. Thank you for that, Eugenie. And not only that, but keeping to time. I'm very appreciative because I'm under pressure here. But what you say really strikes me, and that's a little bit what I tried to say in the beginning. And I'm going to turn to you now, Jose Pugas, because clearly we have to walk the talk. And you've indicated that so many companies have signed these commitments, but are they really walking the talk? And we can say the same about governments. From a Brazilian financial institution perspective, and also with a new election coming up, and seeing very clearly the Bolsonaro strategy of just penetrating as fast as possible through the forest, how do we really up the bar and walk that talk?
Well, let's set the clock. We have 28% of all the tropical forests in the world, Brazil. If we're talking that 1/3 of the solution of the climate changes goes through forests, we have 1/3 of the tropical forest in the world. But at the same time, we have only $2 trillion in assets under management in Latin America. So we have 28% of the solution, but we have less than 3% of the resource to make it work. So we are on the front line. We are the only ones that can't give excuse not to do something independently on the government. So the private sector can't wait any kind of government transition to make the right thing. That's what we have to be always focusing, always highlighting. At JGB, we truly trust that our commitment to net zero, and we are signatories of the Net Zero Asset Management Initiative, we decided that it would be on 2040. We had to be net zero to 2040 on 100% of our portfolio. But at the same time, to do that, we also have to be deforestation free till 2025. And we have to be nature positive to 2030, and also social inclusive. Those are our deadlines. But there's a small role that we're occupying in a much major scheme of things. In order to accomplish this task, and we're talking about a country that 25% of our GDP is based on agriculture. And we are the 4th largest emitter, GHG emitter, with 80% in the world, with 80% of all the emissions connected to agriculture and land use. We can't afford to help companies to make the transition. When you look at our stock exchange, we have less than 400 listed companies. So we can make a lot of noise, we can make a lot of transformations with few actions, connecting with companies that are highly concentrated on deforestation risks. So we have to be innovative, we have to be collaborative, we can't be confrontational. We have to point fingers, but more than that, we have to be engaged with companies so we can work together on the transition. That's what JGB is doing, and that's why IFAC and other programs are so important to address properly the size of the challenge and the need for engagement that is demanded for this transition.
Thank you so much, Jose, on the fact that we need to be engaged with companies, but I would assume also we need to bring people on the journey, and that's absolutely key. And so I'd like to open up a quick discussion because we have 2 questions. I think I'm going to take one for this panel. And in particular, look at that relationship also, as you say, feed, fiber, fuel, it's all interconnected. We see the value chain disruptions right now from the Ukraine. What are the benefits now for financial sector commitment like this when we see so many financial institutions that are hedging their bets on this short-term crisis, in particular in the area of food and fuel? I don't know who wants to answer that question.
Well, I can just
we'll go to Jose.
Absolutely. No, I'll try to be quick. Of course, the situation now creates some short-term negative effects. But actually, if you look at the energy space, for instance, high energy prices is good in terms of curbing energy demand, encouraging energy efficiency, and making investments in renewable, but also nature-based solutions more profitable. So we really have to look beyond 2022. Is my key message.
Jose?
Yes. In Brazil, when you look at our economy, we are an exporting economy. When you look at agriculture, most of the GDP is based on agricultural exporting. So in Brazil, it's much easier for the financial sector to identify the cost of non-compliance to be nature positive. Addressable markets for Brazilian products are getting more and more scarce, as well that the access to capital from Brazilian companies to international capital is getting shorter and shorter each year that passes without deforestation indicators going worse and worse. So as financiers, independently, if you are ESG oriented or not, there is a very real financial risk. There's affecting the competitiveness. When you look at our companies, our companies are already being traded with a discount because of the ESG risks. So when you look at the Ukraine crisis, when you look at all those four horsemen of apocalypses that we are facing right now in the international landscape, it's the inflation created by that, and I totally agree with Jan, it creates our context to be faster on our transition, but it also creates a lot of social distress. And this social distress, it's creating a very hostile environment on anti-ESG movements. So we have to be very careful about that, and we have to work as financiers, as business community, and as government to also reduce the social distress that is caused by the inflation and to not be serving as an anti-ESG agenda. So that's my concern right now.
Justin?
Yeah, 3 quick comments. I think we keep having these pledges, as you rightly said at the beginning, and what we've now got to do is turn pledges into action. And we keep hearing, the data around just that nature underpins society, right? So either we just say that, or we believe that, right? And I think increasingly we've got to move into a sort of deeper belief about that. Indigenous
and how do we
people
create the
have
economies
never,
of scale?
but I think what we've got an opportunity today to be doing, and for the decade ahead, is not to just be buffeted by the short-term wins and the short-term crises, but to recognize that there are deeper changes occurring, and that's what all of those crises are pointing to, and that business as usual is no longer possible. So the institutions that are going to be leading in 10 years' time are the institutions that recognize that deeper current and that opportunity to now be building a much more nature positive, climate positive future, which has people at the center of it, but is actually restoring and repairing our relationship with nature, because we know there are food systems that we can develop that feed the population without destroying the planet. We know there are ways to build the economy in a way that is more in harmony. And there are more and more companies starting to move in that direction. And that's where capital has to flow to. There will be many who are still trying to sort of pretend nothing is changing and trying to make a quick buck from this, that, and the other, and the disruptions that are inevitably there with any crisis. But we have to start tapping into the deeper wavelength of change that's here. And that's where I think what we have to do is mobilize more people to be stepping into that and moving beyond the rhetoric into real action.
We clearly need courage. And it's also clear that we can tap into the subconsciousness of COVID, because many people realize that we need to come back to what's most essential. And so I'd like to ask you, Eugenie, because there's this question around how we get more people on board. What are the economies of scale? How do we share best practice? How do we make others realize that there is a financial risk if we continuously only look at the short term and not at the long term?
Well, I think that this initiative, the commitment to eliminate deforestation from, we've got the 30.
It's on?
Yeah, 30 organizations which have signed it already. I think we now have enough momentum to get a lot more of investors on board to really send a signal to governments and to companies that far faster action is needed. And we're hoping that there are many benefits to signing this commitment, sharing best practice, collective engagement. We have a much stronger voice if we do it together. And I think that the more investors, obviously, the more investors that join this, the stronger voice we'll have, and the more that companies and governments will realize that they need to do a lot more.
Thank you. So what I would like to do now is thank the panel very much also for your incredibly short remarks and poignant remarks, because in the brevity, you did not leave the depth, and ask you to take your seats. We are going to move now into a call to action, which is a pre-recorded video from Mary Shapiro. And what I'd like to do is ask Eva to come and sit next to me in the interest of time while the video is showing. And Eva Zabi is actually going to be taking over the moderation role. She's the Executive Director of Business for Nature. And as we've heard about the importance of corporations coming on board and walking the talk, I think you're a perfect person to come up and replace me, Eva. So can we show the video, please?
Good morning. Thank you for joining. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, was formed just over 1 year ago, bringing together 7 net zero alliances in the financial sector. Each of these alliances, covering asset owners and managers, insurers, banks, service providers, and investment consultants, has established mandatory commitment criteria as part of the UN Race to Zero, a campaign for non-state actors to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, with significant reductions by 2030, which the IPCC has identified as necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. More than 500 financial institutions have now made these commitments. GFANZ exists to tackle sector-wide challenges associated with the net zero transition, helping to ensure high levels of ambition are met with credible action. Central to those challenges is defining how financial institutions can honor their commitments and turn their net zero targets into concrete action that supports the transition across the entire economy, reducing global emissions and limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. The IPCC is clear that achieving the Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 degrees is impossible without an urgent focus on forests and nature. Forest loss and degradation are both a consequence and a major cause of our changing climate. More than 23% of the world's emissions stem from land use activity, including logging, deforestation, and farming. We see a similarly bleak picture on the biodiversity front. Healthy ecosystems and biodiversity underpin human survival. And yet, according to the World Wildlife Fund, the rapid loss of species we are experiencing today is estimated to be between 1,000 and 10,000 times higher than the natural extinction rate. Biodiversity loss and ecosystem destruction can have profound implications for companies with land-based value chains, and therefore will have an impact on those institutions that finance, insure, and invest in those companies, including GFANZ members. The World Economic Forum has estimated that more than half of the world's economic output is moderately or highly dependent on nature, and thus exposed to risk from biodiversity loss. Practical resources to understand and address how businesses contribute to and are exposed to risks from biodiversity loss are emerging in the finance sector, including through the work of the TNFD. Over time, financial institutions will need to harness these tools to articulate how they will work with clients and portfolio companies to reduce their negative impacts on nature and support nature-positive solutions. On the upside, there is significant opportunity to support nature while also supporting economic growth. The World Economic Forum estimates that nature-positive solutions can create 395 million jobs and generate trillions in economic activity by 2030. Earlier in June, the Race to Zero campaign launched their updated requirements, which include, as leadership criteria, committing to protect nature and biodiversity, raising the bar on what it means to lead on net zero. On the same day that the new criteria were launched, GFANZ released a global framework for net zero transition planning for financial institutions, which is now open for public consultation. This framework is central to our efforts to provide financial institutions with the tools they need to credibly turn their net zero commitments into action. This framework outlines the 10 components of a credible net zero transition plan, with recommendations and guidance for each. The components represent a common framework for financial institutions to detail the real actions they will take and the metrics and accountability mechanisms they will establish to fulfill their net zero commitments. Our recommendations and guidance on transition plans make it clear that financial institutions' role in the net zero transition is to finance and enable real-world greenhouse gas emissions reduction. That means working with real economy clients and portfolio companies to ensure that they are aligning their own business strategies with science-based pathways to net zero. The report also references the efforts by 33 financial institutions to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation in investment portfolios and financing activities by 2025, an initiative which I was delighted to help launch at COP26 in Glasgow last year. We've included deforestation in our GFAN's transition plan guidance as we see it as a key issue for any financial institution that has made a net zero commitment. We've also referenced biodiversity as a key area for future work, and we look forward to engaging with the TNFD and other organizations working on this topic as financial institutions work to translate their growing understanding of contributions to and risks from biodiversity loss into action to prevent it. I encourage you to engage in our public consultation and help build a strong, shared understanding of how the financial sector will transition to net zero. I also encourage you not to wait, but to act now to understand and address risks and opportunities relating to deforestation and nature, including joining the financial sector commitment to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation that was launched at COP26. We need to work together to take ambitious action and to deliver net zero. We can't do this without tackling deforestation and investing in nature hand in hand with climate. Thank you for your time and attention to these critical issues.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name's Eva Zabe, and I have some good news and bad news. The good news is we've never seen this level of momentum. We've never seen people talk from companies, from government, from financial institutions with this level of fluency. So although we're, saying, of course, we need to go from pledges to action, suddenly let's just take a moment and think back 5 years and see how far this conversation has come. The bad news is that we have 3 more really quick conversations. You're stuck with me as a moderator, and there's no time for a potty break. So we'll dive right in. The first conversation, we're going to look at investments. Then we're going to dig into where are we on this journey? And then we're going to get some real content from companies on the actions they're taking. So to kick off on investing in nature-based solutions and using investments to help unlock the power of nature and incentivize more corporate action, it's my absolute pleasure to invite Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, who's the CEO of the Global Environment Facility. He's joining virtually, but then Peter Harrison, the CEO of Schroders, to join me on the stage. Very welcome. And then Rosalind Stein, who's the head of climate and biodiversity at AXA. So as we all settle in, one quick question, show of hands, please. Who thinks today that nature-based solutions are investable today? Some wiggly hands, some hands up, some lots of hands up. Well, actually, the good news is they are. UNEP wasn't a trick question because there's way more to come. But according to UNEP, about over $130 billion a year currently flows into nature-based solutions, most of which comes from public funds. Is that enough? No, we also need the private sectors to step up. And overall, investments will need to triple by 2030 and increase fourfold by 2050 if we want to tackle nature, climate, and people challenges in time. So the issue we have is that nature is not valued properly in our ecosystem, in our current economic system. Because if you included the real value of nature in all of our decision making, then de facto, the best investments, the default investments would be the ones that have better outcomes for nature and people. And that's obviously not happening today. So without, am I there's someone else on this panel. That's great. It's expect the unexpected. It's great. But we're all in one big conversation here, so that's great. Carlos Manuel, so good to see you, Carlos Manuel. Thank you for joining. Starting with you first, please. We know that we need to upscale financial flows to trillions for nature-based solution investments, and we need to incentivize businesses to shift their business models. So what challenges and opportunities have you identified in terms of nature-based solution investments? Over to you, Carlos Manuel.
Oh, thank you so much, Eva. What a pleasure to be here. So let me begin with 4 overarching facts. 1, in the last 200 years, we have lost 1/3 of all forests, and I'm not talking tropical forests, I'm talking temperate and boreal forests around the planet, 1/3. Another third are highly degraded, and we just have 1/3 of the planet forest in a pristine manner. Nevertheless, we log them irrationally. Primary forests in the south or in the tropics or in the north are too valuable to be logged as we are doing that because of the climate, biodiversity, and human benefits. That's the first fact. Second fact, humans invest 400 times more financial resources in economic activity that destroy forests than what we invest in forest conservation. Third fact, every time a country generates deforestation, land use change, and ecosystem degradation, the the GDP increases. And fourth fact, there is nothing that has proven to be more successful to revert in deforestation than protected areas and giving and recognizing rights to indigenous communities and local communities. Those are the 4 facts that we need to, and there's a fifth, Eva. Deforestation, land use change continues to be legal in many countries. And we all talk about addressing deforestation, but it continues to be legal in many countries. And just we got a major issue of policy. So those facts should be what drives any conversation on how we should position nature as a cost-effective way to achieve not just climate progress and action, but also across the different Rio Convention and yes, definitely within the SDGs. What I strongly believe that we have is a major problem of policy incoherence. Countries do not have the right policy frameworks, incentives that makes all public and private investment align with the Paris Agreement and eventually the future new CBD framework. So it's not just a matter of identifying the size of the gap and trying to promote private sector investment if we don't level the economic playing field. For most of the companies, it makes economic sense to keep on doing business as usual because there is no incentives to do that. So that is a key element that we need to understand. And most of the deforestation that is happening comes through development policies, particularly from the agricultural sector. If we stop investing in economic activity that destroy nature, the cost of protecting nature will go dramatically down. So we need to address 2 issues, and I conclude with this, Eva. We need to work on policy coherence. This is, policy coherence means reinforcing political decisions across different sectors that responds to a common vision. Unfortunately, the way we all have organized the decision-making structure at the government level bring this confrontation. And the confrontation in the South, in the global South, is very clear within ministries of environment and ministries of agriculture. That's one thing. And the other thing, we can double the size, triple the size of ODA. You can triple the size of my organization, the Global Environment Facility, the largest provider of financial resources, grant resources to the developing world. That will never be enough. It will be enough if we mobilize strategically resources from all sources, particularly if we work in more effectiveness in the use of public expenditures at the country level. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Carlos Manuel. And what you're essentially alluding to is this systems transformation policy system, regulatory environment, financial system, legal system you were talking about, so that we can really scale and speed up. Thank you so much. And I'm now really delighted to hand over to you, Peter Harrison, CEO of Schroders. And just as context, the signatories to the finance sector commitment to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation also commit as part of that to scale up nature-based solutions investments by 2025, which is obviously essential to tackle deforestation. And it also critically serves as an incentive or a driver to corporations to increase their own action and change their business models. So, Peter, what are your views on the progress on nature-based solution investments so far? And if you could please share with us how Schroders is contributing to this agenda. Thank you so much.
I'm not a CSO, I'm a CEO, so I'm not going to talk about the science. There's lots of people in here way more qualified than me, but what I want to talk about is how you change your business to enable this capital to flow. And I think the first thing to say is a word of warning, I think, that although GFANZ has made great progress getting people to sign up to net zero, actually the number of firms that have set a science-based target to support that is really very low indeed. So I think saying who is actually setting a science-based target and who is publishing the clarity of that transition is challenge number one. Challenge number two is, so that's an entirely negative comment, but I think it's really important that we get that on the table. We have set a science-based target, I should say. Challenge number two is it took us 15 to 20 years to get the language of carbon and the disclosures of carbon to be sensible in people's reports. Today, it is virtually impossible to get good data around nature. And if we spend 15 or 20 years deciding what TNFD looks like, we're going to miss this opportunity. So we have to get really good disclosure into companies' reports very clear. And today, you know, with a couple of very notable and good exceptions, really, you open a company's report and accounts, and except for some warm words, you see very, very little. And the asset management industry, of which I'm a part, really has historically worked on two dimensions. It's worked on risk and return. And all of a sudden, we've now got a third dimension. And the third dimension is what's the impact you're having in generating those returns? But until you can measure that impact, you're not going to be able to answer to it to your clients. You're not going to be able to report to it. The regulators around the world are not going to be satisfied. So we've got to solve the data issue with a matter of urgency. We've recently taken a stake in a business called Natural Capital Research, run by Professor Cathy Willis and others in Oxford, to try and embrace technology to do more measurement. But whilst the science, the ecological data from a top down is really clear, what is really, really unclear is the amount of clarity there is when it comes to individual corporates. We've got to solve that with a matter of urgency. So what are we doing with our business? Well, first of all, we've got to support that data and we've got to push companies to set science-based targets. Second, we've got to engage with the 150 or so businesses which are key to making this transformation. And that means just hiring a lot of people to do detailed engagements with businesses to see that transformation. Third, we've got to motivate more of our clients that this is important. And you know, I would say today in the asset management world, probably 50% of clients want to have a conversation, and very few of them want to actually make set clear. So how do we report on people and planet, and how do we make that real? And finally, how do we provide the products that enable them to make that real? And I think, you know, we're about to announce a partnership with a very major conservation charity to allow capital to flow into those projects. So companies which want to optimize, not just for risk and return, but for carbon and for nature, can actually have opportunities to do it. But I think we've got to change lots of things. It's a bit like changing diversity and inclusion. You've got to change lots of things in your business, but it's time to do that rather than just sign pledges.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. And really excited to hear about that call also for more data and disclosure. And that's in fact in the biodiversity discussions on the global biodiversity framework in the CBD, we're pushing for and calling for mandatory assessment and disclosure. And the leading companies are asking for that to be included in the framework, because that in turn will just provide this data information flow that everyone requires in a more standardized way. So thank you so much for that, Peter. And now it's my pleasure to go back online to you, Rosalind so Rosalind Stein, Head of Climate and Biodiversity at AXA, also a signatory of the commitment letter, and that implies increase in investment in nature-based solutions. Please, could you share with us some examples of innovative finance that are currently available for investments? Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person. So AXA is a French insurance company. We're also an asset owner and manager. We have close to 1 trillion euros in assets under management. And we also committed, and we joined the pledge late last year to fight deforestation. At that time, I think it's also important to mention that AXA does not wait for perfect metrics to act. We announced at the same time a policy to address commodities-driven deforestation because we do see what is within our control. We can act, we can carry out screening, we can exclude today the most dangerous and economic activities related to commodity-driven deforestation in certain geographic regions, and we can also engage with actors that we see are on the right path to progress. At the same time, we also committed 1.5 billion euros investments in forests, which we see as a very exciting opportunity, a nature-based solution for a large institutional investor for AXA, because it is an asset class that is both carbon neutral and is also one that is largely immune to economic cycles, which we can imagine in the current climate, both of those things are quite attractive to a long-term investor like AXA. Before I go into a little bit more detail, however, I think it would be helpful to recall what is a nature-based solution for those investors in the room that might be interested in exploring this a little bit further. What a nature-based solution is, we derive our understanding of it from the IUCN definition. So it's a science-based definition. And it's all about understanding the interaction between human activity and nature. It's about a nature-based solution, as the IUCN defines it, is a solution that is designed to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural and modified ecosystems, whilst also addressing societal challenges and providing human well-being and also biodiversity benefits. So it's helping us think, therefore, about how we can work with nature. There are 3 types of actions that can constitute a nature-based solution, which include preservation of existing ecosystems, improving management of ecosystems, and also restoration of ecosystems. Now, obviously, for an investor today, where we understand, as you've alluded to, Eva, at the start, ecosystemic services are not yet all monetized, an investor is going to be looking for a financial return. They do exist, and the example of forests that I've given is one that we often like to refer to. AXA has activities in a number of European countries where we manage forests. We also have committed 500 million euros through our impact investing strategy to supporting nature-based solutions. And these investments predominantly take place in emerging markets. And here we have examples such as investments we've made in Southeast Asia to restore peatland and rainforests in zones where there are also a number of IUCN threatened species that are there. Now, the monetization of that activity comes through generating voluntarily accredited carbon credits that can be then sold on the markets. In the example in Europe, obviously it's the agroforestry activity where we can manage those forests responsibly, but also generate income through the wood that is sold. So that's one example of a nature-based solution in which AXA currently invests. There's a second one, and a really exciting one that we quite recently announced, relating to regenerative agriculture. And I think what's really exciting about this opportunity is that it looks beyond compensation or beyond offsetting solutions, which can sometimes sit alongside business as usual activities. So AXA announced with Tikehau Capital, which is a private equity fund here in France, and with Unilever, the intention to create an impact fund to invest in projects and businesses that support regenerative agricultural practices. This is a fund that will be open to other investors, and it will be investing around the world. It's not just focused on investments in Europe, for example. And there are 3 key themes where we aim to invest. The first is activities that protect the health of soils, because healthy soils are essential for carbon sequestration and also to support water supplies around agricultural activity. The second theme is we will hope to invest in new products that respond to a growing world population and demand from consumers for new, more sustainable and healthy products. And the third theme in which we aim to invest is we want to be able to finance technological solutions that support a transition to regenerative agriculture. So that's two examples from AXA where we think we have a strong conviction that it is possible today to invest in nature-based solutions following the science around what is a nature-based solution. There are still challenges ahead, but again, taking the example of metrics, we cannot wait for precise quantification. We cannot wait for perfect, unfortunately, policy settings either. We must each do our part, and these are some of the ways that AXA has chosen to act. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rosalind. So anyone can get in touch with you if they want to join that impact fund on regenerative agriculture, going once, going twice. No, how long do they have to get in touch with you? We can share your email if so. We're going to wrap up this first conversation, but I just wanted to check with the three panelists if there were any reflections based on this conversation or any, something that keeps you up at night that you still can't crack and you think we've got to advance on this one piece. You mentioned data earlier, Peter, but is there something else that you just want to share with this group so that collectively we can work on moving forwards? And then maybe I'll ask Carlos Manuel and Rosalind.
No, I completely agree with Rosalind that we can't wait for data, but the reality is that what gets managed, what gets measured gets managed. It's a cliche, and I think in a world where regulators are putting a huge amount of pressure to demonstrate, we've got to have that work stream working really, really fast. And it frustrates me that's taking as long as it is, because it's very easy for us to talk about the need for action. What we've got to say is how are we all making it real? And that's the bit that frustrates me so much in this discussion.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And also, I think what you only measure what you care about. And that's the shift that's happened over the past maybe 2 to 3 years, where suddenly, okay, we're needing the data. He says the demand for the data. Carlos Manuel?
Yes, thanks, Eva. And my contribution here, where we are in this conversation, is the following. At this point, I see that this conversation on nature-based solution, reverting the rate of deforestation, the benefit on climate and biodiversity is a very top-down or northern conversation. It is not happening at the level of developing countries. You go to the Amazon nations, you go to the Congo Basin nations, Southeast Asia, nobody talks about this. They are talking about the recovery, post-pandemic recovery. They're talking about fiscal deficit. They're talking about budget cuts. They're talking about jobs, and they're talking about debt. This is very serious, debt. I know a country in Latin America that has, in South America, that has 90% forest cover. And they have 6.7 fiscal deficit. The Minister of Finance doesn't know how to pay the salaries of teachers and policemen the following month. And the country is full of oil, gas, iron, gold. And they got all the companies, the extractive and timber, of course. And they got all the major extractive companies telling the Minister of Finance, we can resolve your fiscal deficit in a matter of a couple of months. So this is the reality that we have in the Global South. This is what we worked with the Jeff. That reality needs to be recognized. That's one point. The second point, these countries that are dealing with this situation, they have the largest carbon forest stocks of the planet, high in biodiversity, high in human well-being. And the carbon market, carbon forest market, recognizes only $7 to $10 a ton of carbon. That doesn't match the cost of opportunity of doing the wrong things in the landscape. So how are we going to revert the level of deforestation in the tropical countries if they are being paid $10 or $7 per ton of carbon? I was involved, just as an example, Eva, I was involved in the first ever carbon forest transaction, 1997. We in Costa Rica sold 200,000 tons of carbon to Norway. That was before the Kyoto Protocol, before everything, 1997. And you know the price of The ton that we negotiate, $10, 1997. As today, what is the price of the carbon? It's $10, $7 to $10. This is irrational. What is happening is irrational. If we want a market approach solution to deforestation, let's deal with the problems. And again, policies, subsidies, incentives, we need to work understanding the realities of the post-pandemic and the economic recession. And yes, definitely, we need to deal with the price of carbon forests. Otherwise, we will never achieve any progress in the developing world, and we will never achieve the 1.5. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carlos Manuel. And final reflections from you, Rosalind.
Thanks so much. I think those comments from my fellow panelists, I really support what has been shared. And one thing that I do think a lot about at the moment is if we can address, at least from the investor's perspective, deforestation. I think we can, that is a subject where there is data, it's not perfect, where there is momentum, and we've started to make commitments, AXA and Schroders, for example, to move towards an ultimate objective of zero deforestation within our portfolios. And that's one that's really challenging, but one that I think that we can all rise to that challenge. And if we can address that particular subject, I do believe that the link notably between nature and climate will, it means I think we can make a difference. And just a last thing, it may already have been mentioned earlier today, but the TNFD released yesterday the next version of its recommendations, and we sit on the targets and metrics working group. So this is the first set of recommendations, draft recommendations on the types of the categories of metrics that we would like feedback from. So I'd really encourage everyone that has an interest in getting the right data to have a look at the TNFD documents and share their feedback through the Secretariat to help us all improve collectively the way that we report and then use that data. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that prompt. That was really important. Yes, yesterday, check it out, TNFD, and the way they're developing it is really continuously improving and getting input and encouraging everyone to pilot test it. So thank you so much to my panelists. We started off by saying, well, are nature-based solutions investable today? Most of you thought yes. There's obviously more to go. I think what we heard here is, strong call for the systems that investment exists in needs to be strengthened, whether it's policy coherence, legal. We need to make sure we have the right information, that disclosure becomes mandatory. That's my perspective, and many others as well. I think one thing that also Carlos Manuel was talking about, the value of nature and embedding that, there's somehow, we see the demand is increasing to be able to invest in these nature-based solutions. And there are some pockets where it is in all of our shared interests, whether it's the Amazon rainforest or Congo peatlands or whatever it may be, where we collectively can make sure that there's an opportunity for people to direct those funds into something that we will all really benefit from. So thank you so much to the panelists. We're going to do a round of applause and break this silence. Thank you. Okay, so we are going to move on. I don't have any jokes right now, or, this is called the next one is another fireside chat. As a fireside chat, the world's on fire. We're sitting next to it. It's a fireside chat with Nikki Mardas, Executive Director of Global Canopy, and Luis Fernando de Amaral, who's the CEO of the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, who's joining us online. And apologies, Luis, because it was you who joined the previous panel, but now is when I really want to talk with you as well. So now we're going to think a little bit about this journey, some of the insights into the journey to end commodity-driven deforestation. So we know this is important, Nikki. Can you just please, because some of this, it's a little bit overwhelming, right? So you're gonna have a little bit of you're gonna have to help me here a bit with the energy levels in the room.
Excellent.
Should we do
Let's do it.
I don't know. Mexican wave. Let's do it. We're in the football stadium. Oh, you're ready. Okay, from this side, we're gonna do this. Go on, let's do this. This side, make the wave ready and stand up. Oh no, you have to stand up. Yes, okay, very good. Okay, was that good? This is not a fireside chat. This is like looking forward to the World Cup. Nikki, so we're getting a bit, lots of jargon, lots of words people don't really understand, or some people don't understand. Can you just recap for us? There's this new research, it's super important. Where are we on the journey? Use language that everyone can understand, please. Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Apologies. So maybe a very quick recap. What have we heard so powerfully today? Ending deforestation, we know this is the biggest no-brainer to end and tackle our environmental challenges we face. For climate, 11% of emissions. For nature, 80% of terrestrial biodiversity and ecosystem services. But I just want to say, we know that, but how great to hear from Marjun and Nick Robbins about action from central banks, about the TNFD framework and progress, and Eva, what you're saying about getting that into regulation. That's the energy we need. That's the momentum that we need. And third, people. Tropical forests, ending deforestation for people, indigenous peoples and local communities who live in tropical forests. And Chai put it so powerfully and so personally. But I really would, because we've been working in this area for many, many years, and I just want to share a request, a challenge to all of us to keep people center stage in this discourse, because often people are the first group to drop off when we say for climate, for nature, for people. Please, let's focus on people and not let that agenda fall off as it sometimes does, because we don't always have Chai with us to put it so personally and so eloquently. So we know deforestation is growing and continuing. I will throw just one stat at you, but it's a shocking one. Brazil, 15-year high in deforestation, but in May alone, we lost an area the size of London, where we are now in the Amazon, at the start of a ferocious dry season and burning season ahead. 2/3 of deforestation we know is driven by agricultural expansion. We've heard about food, feed, fiber, fuel. And so at the heart of the issue then, we're all part of a deforestation economy. We all use these products, and 50% of our supermarkets through complex supply chains. They're in our finance, not just another F. They're in our pensions, 20% of UK pensions contributing to deforestation. But at the heart of this are flag companies that we're going to focus on in this discussion and the analysis from the report that we've done. Food, land, and agriculture companies. And good news, the data, as was said by Rosalind, the data's better. Let's not wait for the perfect. We're getting now critical work on science-based targets for this area. But it was really, really good to hear about the 8.7 trillion not being touted as a huge number, but being touted as a number that is too small. Thank you, Justin and others. We need to see more commitments. You can't have net zero finance at 10 times deforestation-free finance commitments by the finance sector. That doesn't make sense. We need more financial institutions to sign up to that commitment. But I will say, because we've been speaking to financial institutions for 12 years on deforestation, but we've seen more momentum in the last 12 months than in those 12 years. So, okay, momentum, good. So with that, maybe I can tell you a bit about the report and some of the results we've seen. So here it is, it's released today. Why net zero needs zero deforestation now. And this.
So where do people go to just download it right now?
Where's the best place? The Race to Zero website. Right.
Race to Zero.
So you can get the report on the Race to Zero website. Please take a look. This report starts with 350 flag companies who are chosen because they have the biggest exposure to deforestation and therefore influence on solving the problem. They need to take action. We at Global Canopy have been tracking these 350 companies and reselecting them each year for 8 years, since 2015, if that math works, 7, 8 years. And we reselect each year. And we also look at social and rights issues within our assessments. This report, today's report, takes those 350 companies and it applies the climate change lens, the net zero lens. So thanks to SBTI, to the Accountability Framework Initiative for collaborating on this report with us, and some results. Let's start with the good news. Tremendous momentum. So 40% of those 350 have commitments have net zero commitments, and that's a 5-fold increase in the last few years. So we are seeing the companies that matter most for deforestation, therefore climate change, coming on board with serious targets, not the less sort of reputable.
SBTI then.
So here we've got a commitment to net zero by at least 2050 and 1.5 degree pathway. And let's come on to SBTI, because as was said before, that's the step we need. We then need science-based targets to back it up. And that's where Luis comes in with the new guidance, the new work that SBTI has done. And generally, these companies are scoring 15% better than other companies who don't have net zero targets on deforestation. So, okay, a little bit of good news there. But it's only 9 companies of the nearly 150 that have net zero commitments that are doing well, who score over 60% in this assessment. And that means they're doing well across 4 different critical categories, including on reporting and implementation. So there we have a sign from the assessment that says it's not just commitments. We're seeing implementation, we're seeing reporting, but that's 9 companies. That's 6%. Okay, it includes some of the biggest companies in the world, the Nestle's, Pepsi, Unilever, Mars. That's good, and we can learn a lot from them. Of course, they have more to do too, but they have many lessons to share. The not good news is that that leaves 90% of companies who, if you take this analysis, are on course to miss their net zero targets that they themselves have set because of failure to act on deforestation or failure to act fast enough. So that's really a key finding that I think we should all take home, and it's a clarion call to action, really. 75 companies, as you'll read in the report, are making decent progress. They're approaching this issue systematically. They can build. It's challenging, but it's doable for those. But we have 58% who have no net zero target at all, let alone those making no progress really at all on deforestation. So the majority have no net zero target, and it's a key opportunity, of course, for them to build resilience. Not just an opportunity, though, it's an imperative because of everything we've heard today. How do they do that? Well, the data's better, the tools are better, but really this is where I think Luis's work comes in with the SBTI, because unless we link this to science-based targets, we're just floating in the air with some of these commitments. So I think maybe that's
amazing.
a good place to stop.
Pretty shocking. Thanks, Nikki, though, because it does give us a bit of a reality check of how much progress has been made. Luis, thank you so much for joining us. Clearly, there's this major gap and an opportunity for companies to make progress. But so what should companies do next, and what tools are available, or what guidance can they use for those who are thinking now, oh no, what do we, let's get going now. Over to you, Luis.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join, although virtually. Thanks for the invitation. This issue is very close to my heart, as I worked for almost 2 decades on reducing deforestation, promoting sustainable food and ag supply chains, and financing farmers and nature-based solutions. The impacts of climate change are increasingly devastating, and the forest, land, and agricultural sector, one of the most affected, but also, as Nick had pointed out, a very important source of emissions. To keep 1.5 degree target within reach, to tackle food crisis risks, and to enable global transformations to a net zero future, land-related emissions and removals are paramount. This means halting deforestation, restoring land, and improving agricultural production practices. But that is not just doing it on the side, but taking to the center of business models, supply chains, and operations of companies working in this sector. Commitments to eliminate deforestation supply chains were made before, some more than a decade ago. Advances have happened, but challenges have also remained. From my experience, one of the reasons was a lack of standardization within goals and common definitions of success from the start. Without it, even good work by companies can be overshadowed by what then becomes a storytelling competition and disputes over what really constitutes a successful outcome. This clarity is key for success. Today, companies have the tools at hand to do so in all of the fronts needed, or as what I like to call on the 6 A's for corporate climate action. So on the first A, activation. Under the updated Race to Zero criteria, companies must pledge to halt deforestation and protect biodiversity, making a line with SBTi upcoming methods for forest, land, and agriculture. Then we have ambition. There's where we come in. The upcoming launch of a specific methodology called FLAG by the Science-Based Targets Initiative will provide companies with the standardization and clarity needed to deliver such transition and bringing nature and carbon worlds together. Accounting. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol will soon publish a first beta guidance for consultation on accounting, which will bring additional clarity to corporate inventories on this area. Action. There's now consensus from civil society and business on broader high-level actions that are needed for nature, with initiatives such as Business for Nature, Accountability Framework, or Tropical Forest Alliance working on these areas. Accountability. Scalable technology-based solutions do exist to map, measure, and report progress on deforestation supply chains, like Global Forest Watch Pro system, or track global flows on commodities at risk, like TRACE, for example. This is then important for good disclosure to initiatives such as CDP or TNFT, or even upcoming regulatory requirements. Finally, advocacy. There's a push that all leaders raising the bar in this space should bring others together along that journey, pushing this agenda to its suppliers, clients, investees, and even policymakers that are needed to raise the floor, as has been pointed out. So what to do? I have been saying that one, we need to set ambition today, an ambition that is aligned with what science tells us is needed. Two, we need to define, or companies need to define a plan for the short term, how to tackle those issues on the short term. And three, establish a vision for the long one, how we are going to get to the net zero on the longer term. So flag companies that have not set net zero targets on their Race to Zero must do so. We need that movement. They then should use the upcoming flag methodology by SBTi to clarify and standardize scope and ambition and bringing climate and nature together. For that, they also need to account and report its association emissions. Tools to monitor and demonstrate progress on deforestation supply chains are already widely adopted and could be used. Additional accounting guidance that will come up to translate land-related emissions into corporate inventories. These steps are paramount to give all stakeholders, including investors, the confidence that they will deliver on their net zero commitments, which means the broader private sector, like financial institutions, also need to determine and incorporate actions on nature. Finally, companies are also encouraged to start looking into other non-carbon nature-related impacts like biodiversity and water, for example, by getting involved with our sister organization, the Science-Based Targets Network. To conclude, we cannot tackle climate without acting on nature too. In my experience, it is good business to look at those incentives and disincentive structures to move this agenda ahead. The forest, land, and agricultural sector has now the toolbox at hand to clarify its ambition and to act on it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Luis. And it was really good to hear your recap message that keeps on coming up today on we can't tackle climate change without nature as our ally. And I just wanted to ask both of you just one super quick clarifying question before we move on. Because a few companies, maybe not in the flag sector, so sorry for going off on a slight tangent, but important clarification, which is because the key message is you've got to reduce emissions first across all scopes and then compensate wherever you can. There's this concern around, which is justified, of offsetting being seen as then greenwashing and then bundling it all up and then not prioritizing the emissions reduction first, which is essential, there maybe is a little bit of clarification both of you could very quickly provide to companies that are wondering, should we then be waiting to invest in nature-based solutions as part of our net zero commitments, because we first need to reduce emissions and then we need to invest in nature, when I'm hoping that actually we don't have time and the urgency should be there. And so what advice would you give to avoid that being perceived as greenwashing related to offsetting? So I'm bringing this up. Maybe Nikki, you want to start, or just with some quick reflections, and then Luis?
Yeah, absolutely. No, we have to do them all together. And here we're focused, this conversation is focused on deforestation. And so to tackle this problem right up front, I mean, it's been put into the Race to Zero's principles and criteria added last month as, you know, a central plank, a no-brainer, end deforestation. But alongside of that, of course, we have to look at regeneration, and we have to look at the transformation of agriculture. Those things take time. We've heard from companies that are doing great work. I think we're going to hear more. And these things are happening now, and they need to continue happening now. The crazy thing is that at the same time as doing all this great work, we continue to see $5.5 trillion each year going into pulling down primary forests. And there are, you know, not enough commitments on that, and certainly not enough action on that. So no, absolutely, all three at once. But when it comes to deforestation, let's get out of the deforestation game. It makes zero sense. And here we are seeing 8.7 trillion in finance committed to ending it. But let's have banks step up. Let's have others step up. We need to see the 130 trillion, recognizing that ending deforestation is part of getting to net zero.
Thank you so much, Nikki. And final reflections from you, Luis.
Thank you. Yeah, no, absolutely. Those things need to be concomitant, right? We don't have enough time to lose, but it needs to be on the center of the business model, right? What cannot happen is just do something on the side and continue, as Nikki said, keep involved, continue to have supply chains that are not being mapped and tracked. So, and continue to have emissions to grow and just compensating that, right? So what the SBTi net zero standard says is that you have to tackle your emissions and you have to bring that to the center of the actions. Then it's very encouraged that you do go beyond your value chain to mitigate those emissions. That's very encouraged, but you cannot guarantee that your emissions keep on growing, right? And in the end of the journey, once you have residual emissions at the very end, then you must compensate that. So I think that's the journey. Guarantee that your emissions are not going up and they're on track. Also go there to actually invest and promote nature-based solutions, as long as you're tackling them within the center of your business case and not allowing your emissions just to go up. And then the very end of the journey, once there's the residual emissions that we're never going to be able to get out of the equation, then we must compensate them.
Thank you so much for that very clear response. It's really, I'm sure a number of companies will be happy for that clarity as well. So with that, I want to close this quick chat. Thank you so much, Nikki and Luis, for your time, and congratulations on the report that I'm sure a number of people are going to Race to Zero to check out right now. So now one round of applause before our final session. Okay, so we're now going to, last but definitely not least, we're going to now get into some of the companies that managed to make the cut and are in the report as actually making good progress on deforestation, free supply chains, eliminating deforestation as part of their climate strategies. Rebecca has turned into Thomas, which is great. I know you're both there. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Rob Cameron, Global Head of Product Affairs at Nestle, and then also Thomas Lingard, who's the Global Sustainability Director at Unilever. Right, so as you come on stage, you're here. I was just wondering if we do one very simple show of hands once again to see if you've been listening, which is who here thinks that there's an urgent need now for all companies to increase their action on deforestation. Okay, so at least we're on the same page and you have been listening a bit. So to start off with, Thomas, you made the cut, congrats. You're on the right side of that report. You at Unilever have a net zero target. You've been working on forests for many, many years. You've published your climate transition action plan that includes forest and nature goals. So how do you think about deforestation within Unilever? What are you doing that maybe others are not? And how are you really tackling deforestation in practice? How can it be scaled? Tell us more about Unilever and what we can learn from your experience. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Eva, and thanks everyone for the invitation to be here today. You're right, we have been working on this for a long time. I can't speak for what other companies are not doing, but I think one of the things that's helped Unilever put the fight against deforestation at the center of how we think about sustainability is a holistic approach to not just siloing carbon and nature and human rights and livelihoods and so on. Our business strategy, called the Compass Strategy, is an integrated commercial and sustainability strategy, if you will. And within that, our climate transition action plan has tried to show all of the actions we want to take together to get us on the path to net zero, whilst respecting, planetary boundaries and commitments to human rights and so on. And we have made, this has been a journey. Those of us that have been around a while have sort of seen evolve over the years. We kind of thought we were making good progress over the last decade. Everybody was in the sort of certification game purely, really, at that point. And we made, good progress against the targets that we set back in 2010. But I think, the world's moving on. The technology is moving on, the standards and expectations are moving on, and we've all got to sort of pull our socks up wherever we are in that report. And I think, looking forwards, we've got three main elements to how we are thinking about the deforestation challenge. First is around selective sourcing. For a long time we've been, the model was you sort of buy from anywhere, but you make sure you've got certificates to show that it's sustainable. And I think we think that's not, enough anymore. We're going to a much tighter direct sourcing model, so we know exactly where the commodities we're buying are coming from. That already helps to reduce the risk. We've made a 130 million euro investment in our own palm oil refinery in Sumatra. That means that we end up with direct supply links between palm oil growers and the mill, and you can actually trace exactly, which bunches of palm oil are coming from which plantation into the mill, and that provides a sort of segregated supply chain for us. So that sourcing strategy is fundamental to sort of eliminating deforestation risk. The second thing is smallholders. There is no magic button you can press in the Chief Procurement Officer's office that says, just remove deforestation from the supply chain. This is incredibly complex. On palm particularly, I think not a lot of people know that something like 1.7 million smallholder farmers that produce about 40% of palm oil. And obviously, if we're going to mainstream sustainable sourcing practices into those farmers whilst protecting, their ability for livelihoods, we need a lot of training. We need access to finance. We need, better land rights access to people who haven't got sort of legal tenure on the land they're farming, and we need income diversification strategies. So that is a huge amount of stuff. No one company can do that on their own. This has to be done in partnership with governments, with agricultural extension services and foundations, and everybody else in this space. But that is a big job, and we've had some good success there, but that needs to be scaled massively. And then the final point is technology. I alluded to that before. 20 years ago, you really, could say, well, we just buy the stuff, we don't really know where it comes from, and there was an element of truth in that, right? Because the markets were opaque. And if you look at what's happened in the development of satellite technology and other technology, it's really phenomenal now. And it's really no longer acceptable to say, we just don't know where the stuff comes from. It is possible to find out if you put the legwork in, and we've got brilliant colleagues in our sustainable sourcing team who are doing that, and digital specialists who are getting right on top of this game. Just to mention a couple of the partnerships, we've got a partnership with an organisation called Descartes Labs, who use satellite technology and AI to sort of track changes in forest cover in real time, so you can actually get incident alerts if something happens within a supply shed that you're using. Amazing company called Orbital Insights, which uses effectively anonymized GPS tracking of mobile phones to see where on the roads trucks are moving from and to. So if you start to see a new route open up into an area of forest you know shouldn't be being touched, you can again intervene very quickly. And we're working with Google and the Google Earth Engine as a kind of command center to bring all that together. But we know that, you know, we're a big company and we've maybe got some resources that others haven't. And that's why we were so pleased to be part of the launch of the Forest Data Partnership at COP26. And that's an initiative with the FAO, WRI, NASA, I'm going to forget somebody else, funded by USAID, and of course Google. And that is seeking to try and build an open source verified data ecosystem that everybody will be able to access, so that we've got a shared data system. Because also if everybody has their own data and you end up with arguments about what's where and what's really happening, that's no good either. So I think our vision for this is to build more open source technology that everybody can use. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Super exciting. Another way of getting, in a way, non-biased information that is gaining more traction and awareness is eDNA. You know, when you can go into water samples and just see the DNA of what species are there, what's not, what the status is. And if you have different species, you can also understand the status of, so there's some really cool, innovative technologies to benefit from. So thank you for that. So definitely taking a holistic approach and following that evolution of needing more accountability and transparency. So thanks so much, Thomas, and I'll come back to you, both of you when we think of what's next. But maybe over to you, Rob, in terms of Nestle, and how have you been making progress on to tackle deforestation? And based on your experience, maybe do you have some advice or guidance you'd like to highlight for other companies that are also embarking on this journey, including restoring nature? Thanks so much.
Thanks, Eva, and good morning, everybody. I feel like this panel is a kind of metaphor for the circumstances we face. We don't have time, right? We're right to try and be as brief as possible. You've heard it already, but I'm going to summarize it in a phrase. The economy is a subsystem of the ecosystem, period. It was always true, it's true today, and it will be true in future. Everything we do in our businesses, in our economies, is dependent and is a subsystem of the ecosystem. And nowhere is that more true than for a company like Nestle that depends upon agriculture for the ingredients upon which we depend. Clear. That's why we've been working on deforestation for over 10 years. And it's why in 2019 we committed to publish a net zero action plan, Paris aligned 1.5 degrees, and we did that in 2020. We believe that we've passed our peak in terms of our carbon emissions. We believe that our carbon emissions are now on a permanently downward trajectory, but we also know that our carbon emissions are way too high, way too high. We also are clear that as a company like ours, for us, Scope 3 emissions represent by far and away the greatest part. 90% of our emissions are Scope 3. I'll be blunt with you. I am absolutely sick and tired of seeing announcements from companies, commitments from companies that talk about their net zero ambitions, but are limited to Scopes 1 and 2. Because for many, many companies like ours, it's actually Scope 3 that they need to be focusing on. In our case, 2/3 of our Scope 3 emissions are in agriculture. So we absolutely need to focus on some certain things. And we are clear, and you've heard it already, but let me repeat. There is no net zero without we end deforestation. 1. 2, there is no net zero without a full-scale transition to regenerative agriculture. We absolutely have to turn agriculture from a cause of concern and the problems we face to a source of the solutions, the problems that we face. So second, full-scale transition to regenerative agriculture. And thirdly, and in a way, the most important thing of all, is that, you've heard it from, I think Nikki said it and Luis said it, There is no net zero transition without it is a just and fair transition. We have to put people first. So let me reflect. Was that a round of applause? I think it was a round of applause. I'll take that.
Let's do a proper round.
I want to expand on that a little bit because Nestle, as our chairman often points out, is a tall poppy which catches the wind. We get criticized for lots of things, and to be fair, there are occasions when rightly so. But we had a target to end deforestation by 2020. As we got closer towards achieving that, it became clearer to us that we could achieve it, but we did not know at what cost. And what I mean by that is that we would have concentrated our supply on a handful of key traders with certified supply chains. And yet there were, we knew, within our supply chains, particularly in palm, some smallholder farmers that would have been disenfranchised if we'd aggressively pursued its 2020 shit or bust. We did not do that. We extended it. I'm glad that the report today recognizes the social commitment. So we've put people front and center. The other thing that we've done is we've also wanted to look beyond. Ending deforestation is largely about what you stop doing. Okay, but what about what you're going to do? So as well as thinking about this through the lens of smallholders, last year we launched what we call our forest positive strategy. This is about restoration. So we've committed to plant 200 million trees by 2030, but it's also about taking a more positive approach to working with people to address the causes of deforestation in the first place. And to a large extent, that's about rights. So a human rights approach, a right to a decent livelihood, and land rights. So that is also central to the approach that we're adopting. When we talk about forest positive, you heard a little bit from Thomas just then. One thing we're also now aware of is that we might feel that we're very confident with certified suppliers that we're deforestation free in certain areas. If there is deforestation in the region in which we're sourcing from, our supply chain is at risk. So we absolutely need to take a landscapes approach to this. And what we're learning from our forest positive landscapes thinking is now being applied in this full-on effort that we're making on regenerative agriculture and taking a landscapes approach in the transition on regen ag. This is also happening in places like the Cavalli Forest, for instance, if we move more towards addressing coffee and cocoa in our supply chains. And some of you will know the risks in the Cavalli Forest is facing and thankfully now being attended to. In terms of advice, I did actually have what I thought was a really nice alliterative suggestion around 3 T's, transparency, technology, and trade. Actually, I always thought I was really good at alliterative, memorable things. But what we heard earlier on from Luis, I thought was even better, the 6 A's. But frankly, I'm a bear of little brain, and 6 is far too many things to remember, so I'll crystallize it to 4. Ambition, yes, this is not sequential. Let's be clear, this is not sequential. This is all at once. Ambition, action, accountability, and advocacy. As I sit here today on the advocacy point, Thomas and I, our teams, and together with help from Brunswick and Nigel's team, with our 2 chief executives, are out on the front page of the Financial Times today, standing together, Unilever and Nestle, often referred to as competitors, standing together in public, making a very strong call for action on ending deforestation. As I sit here today, my chief executive, Mark Schneider, is on his way to the Swiss Sustainable Finance meeting to make similar calls in public to Swiss financiers. And I want to make a point about the financial community as well, if I may, just briefly, just to finish off. Yes, it's so welcome to hear Schroders say what Schroders says around the transitions that are being driven, but the scale of subsidies that are actually funding deforestation in the first place, that must end. That must end. And if the financial community wants to accelerate progress, make my boss's life uncomfortable, because that makes my life more comfortable, and it will make everybody's life more comfortable in future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. Maybe I'll just give each of you a chance to reflect on what you've said or any other thoughts moving forward. The systems that are being transformed is essentially what, Rob, you're alluding to, but the fact that you need to come together as these competitors in the market to actually make the systems change that's necessary. But then how do we go, into this scale and speed? Would you like to reflect before we wrap up? I don't know.
That's fine. Have a go. I mean, we were talking just before it kicked off this morning about what would be stopping other companies from doing what Nestlé and Unilever are doing. And I think all of us in companies are faced with infinitely long lists of important issues to work on and solve. And I think a lot of companies just go through a kind of materiality assessment, and deforestation comes out at like kind of number 4 or 5, not number 1, 2, or 3. And so the resources get put elsewhere. And this is kind of classic business school thinking from the 1980s, that you've always got to prioritize and pick the top 3 or 2 or 1. But we're moving to a different world, and I think Justin put it beautifully about the deeper shifts that are happening. We've got to get better at the interconnectedness of thinking, and deforestation may not be your number 1 issue, but if stopping the world going to hell in a handcart is somewhere on your to-do list, then it has to be part of your sustainability plan if you have a forest footprint. And there is no company who's kind of got 80% of the trade in tropical forest commodities. It's not like you can go to a small number of companies and drive systemic change. It is going to require everybody to take action on this, and that will require a shift in how sustainability teams and other companies prioritize this issue in particular.
I think one of the challenges that we've got to rise up to, building on what Thomas says, materiality analyses, you kind of compartmentalize. There's deforestation here, there's climate change there, there's social affairs there, and whatever else. I've become increasingly aware of the fact that we haven't done a good job of connecting the issues together in the public discourse. Somehow or other, everything's thought of in the traditional silo model, and if we absolutely need to stitch these things together. And I was saying to some colleagues yesterday, we've got a patchwork quilt of things going on, and I want to turn it into a beautiful tapestry of real strength and real clarity, where our social affairs, our human rights agenda, and we've got a human rights action plan human rights roadmap with a series of action plans coming. And these need to be part of the same narrative as our regen ag narrative, as our climate narratives, our forest narrative. These are not independent narratives. We've got to find a way to stitch these things together, to show the interconnectedness of these things, and why action in one domain will have a corresponding impact on actions in another domain. That's a big communication challenge, and it's one we must rise up to.
Thank you so much. I do see some questions, but we need to rush on with the agenda. Apologies. Thank you very much, Thomas and Rob. I'm going to wrap up this session and then hand over to Nigel to conclude. And maybe, there was a lot of great insights being shared, and let's focus on the action so the call to action for companies in the room. To recap, all food, land and agriculture companies that have not yet set a net zero target under Race to Zero must do so. Your role is critical to reach a net zero, nature positive and equitable world. We heard from the Science Based Targets Initiative. You can use the FLAG methodology, the food, land and ag methodology, with a commitment to eliminate the conversion of natural ecosystems by 2025, including deforestation and overfishing. We haven't touched on overfishing, but that's also a piece to include. All companies from all sectors should follow either the 3 A's, 4 A's, 6 A's, or Rob's 3 T's, or another one that we've come up with also is assess, commit, transform, disclose, and the first 3 letters form ACT. So assess, which goes back to the materiality, making sure you're focusing on your most material impacts and dependencies, but recognizing how interconnected they are. Commit, setting science-based targets for nature as well as climate. Transform is about shifting your business models, and then disclose on all of the above so that you get that information flow. And I'd also just like to end with the advocacy points, of course. We need businesses, financial institutions to continue to raise this progressive voice calling for policy ambition. It's not only at the climate COP 27, it's also at the biodiversity COP 15 that now has been announced to take place in Montreal in December this year. still under the presidency of China. We literally have the last few months to try and adopt an ambitious global biodiversity framework that can be still the equivalent to the Paris Agreement on climate. Now is the time to be part of that strong voice. We're going to organize a big campaign in the run-up to COP15. It will focus on the need for mandatory assessment and disclosure of impacts and dependencies that will fuel and strengthen greater accountability for the actual impacts of our decisions and investments. There we go. So with that, Mexican wave again, guys? No, maybe not. We did it before, Nigel. Maybe you don't believe it, but we did. We did. Oh, you believe it. So with that, thank you, Thomas and Rob, and I will hand over to Nigel.
All right, speak.
Yeah.
You want to mic me? Great, thank you. So, good morning, everyone. My job as one of 2 UN high-level climate action champions is to push everybody to go faster. Sorry, that's the mandate that 196 countries gave me, so I'm going to do that now. I want to thank all the partners who've come together to put together this event, and I actually particularly want to thank Unilever and Nestle, Rob and Thomas and their CEOs for that example of radical collaboration, where people who are normally typified as competitors come together for the greater need for systems change, and that piece in the FT today. I've just come back from 2 weeks in Africa and then just recently in Lisbon for the Ocean Summit. And in Africa, I was at quite a big gathering of the AFR 100 partners. That's an initiative to try and restore. No, that's an initiative committed to restoring over 100 million hectares of land in Africa. There are 700 million hectares of degraded land in Africa. And one of the most striking interventions, it was very diverse. There was governments, there was philanthropists, there was community organizations, there was investors and developers and forest experts and farming experts. But the intervention which struck me the most was a 70-year-old Kenyan man called Joseph, who stood up and very quietly reminded everyone in the room that, as he put it, somewhere in the forest, there's a man with an axe. And that man, those men, those women with axes, are deciding whether the trees live or the trees die, not on the basis of knowledge of planetary boundaries or international climate change negotiations, but on the basis of the choices they're making to put food in the mouths of their family. So it's exciting that and Robbie said, this is all about people and development. And if you go to Africa and start talking about the need to decarbonize the economy, you just get a lot of baffled looks, right? Because basically sub-Saharan Africa has no emissions. And so that's what you want us to do, right? We've got 600 million people with no access to energy, and hundreds of millions of people with no access to clean cooking, and if you don't have access to clean cooking, guess what? You're cutting down you or someone else is cutting down a tree so that you can cook. The encouraging thing is that in Glasgow, that 32 countries put out a call. They said, we will put hectareage on the table. We will commit to millions of hectares of restoration, but we need support to invest in that. And they called for $2 billion. And I think that $2 billion will be reached. It's not new international climate finance money. That's mostly philanthropic and private finance, because there's a de facto business case for improving smallholder farmer productivity with intelligent landscape restoration. And there's a kicker that those farmers then get some carbon credit finance on top of the productivity benefits, but it's the productivity benefits that are the real driver. And we're starting to see real funds flowing. The first $150 million fund was launched last month. We heard there's another 160 million. Those are coming thick and fast now. I've just been in the Ocean Conference, where the ambassador for Palau reminded us that
they want to get to net zero energy. It's not about forests, but it's about the fact that there is a business case here that we're not solving for, because people are not used to thinking about sub-Saharan Africa or Pacific Islands as places to invest. They need $180 million by 2032 to go 100% renewable, faster than all of the developed countries are planning to do so. And there's a prima facie a business case because they're spending more than 40 cents per kilowatt hour. It's the most expensive electricity in the world because they're importing fuel oil to burn it, to make climate change worse, to drown themselves. But that's the only model because no one's helping them get that investment. So I come back here and I come here and I look at the figures today of, we've gone from 33 financial institutions in Glasgow to 35 committed to halting the financing of agricultural commodity-driven deforestation. So at that rate, 2 and 6 months, it'll take another 125 plus years to get all the GFANZ members. This research that we've just seen shows 9 companies, that's 6% of 148 have net zero targets, but it's less than 3% of the sample size are taking adequate action in their value chains to halt deforestation. So I'm reminded of a conversation I had with the board of one of the largest companies in the world a couple of years ago about the need to transform the business model. When one very thoughtful executive stayed quiet for the first hour and a half of the conversation and then leant forward and asked me, Nigel, do you think we are stupid or we are cowards? And I think that's a question that every single teenager is asking their parents and all of us now. Are we stupid or are we cowards? The evidence is so overwhelming. We're smashing through planetary boundaries. We're destroying economic value. And yet there's a $10 trillion opportunity to take. So do we want to deliberately destabilize the global economy and jeopardize all the development gains of the last couple of decades? Or do we want to take the opportunity? Are we stupid or are we cowards? Is a really valuable and valid question to me, to you individually, and to all of us in this room and watching collectively, and to every one of our C-suite and our CEOs. So I put it to you that we know the problem and we know the solutions. We have the tools. We have when a small number of leading companies are taking adequate action, it shows that it can be done. And we've seen this time and time again. That's a key milestone to scaling up, is that a few are doing it. But I don't want to see Rob and Thomas here next year. I don't want to talk about 3%, right? I want to see the next 10%, the next 20%, the next 30% coming, people who haven't had the smarts or the courage to step up before. Now we're in the city of London. The finance sector has attracted the brightest minds of a generation in the last 30 years as we financialized the entire global economy. And yet the accusation or the question of whether you're smart enough or brave enough, I think particularly lands at the feet of leaders in the finance sector. Finance sector was the last to step up. GFANZ has been an amazing thing, but we had cities stepping up in Paris and we had corporations stepping up in the 3 years before GFANZ was launched. So the call to action is really clear. This pathetic rate of change from 33 to 35 has to go through an inflection point. So we have well over 100 financial institutions by the time we get to Sharm el-Sheikh. And this pathetic less than 3% of flag companies taking adequate action has to go through an inflection point. And let me be very clear, we've just updated the Race to Zero criteria to make it absolutely crystal clear that we expect every member of the Race to Zero to be taking adequate action to eliminate deforestation. And we'll start throwing people out the Race to Zero if they're not doing enough. You're not in the race if you're jogging around the outside smoking a cigarette in your comfy tracksuit. You've got to be on the track, sweating, working hard, taking risks. So that question, it's haunting me and it should haunt you all. Are we stupid or are we cowards? Do we have the smarts to commit to the innovations? This is difficult, right? There's no doubt about it. It's not easy. Thomas and Mark will tell you, right? It's not easy to lead a transformation which requires changes in every bit of business practice, right? Where we're unraveling problems as we go. But we have the smarts, right? But they only are engaged when leadership steps up and says, we're going to do this. And we may not know how we're going to do it, but we're going to commit to doing that. And the really exciting thing is, time after time after time, we see a company step up and throw engineering and financial smarts at problems like this. And consistently, within 3 to 5 years, they're saying, we've got the most motivated workforce, and now we know we can do it 10 years earlier. Just this last 6 months, we've seen Maersk. This is not on deforestation, right? But just as an example, Maersk shipping 2 years ago said net zero 2050. Now they're going for net zero 2040. Mercedes cars said 2039. Now they're saying 2030. Sony said 2050. Now 2040. Now we have investors like Generation and Aviva saying the same. We will have to do this 10 years early because we're not going fast enough now. And those who have the smarts and the courage to step up and lead will reap the rewards. We've seen this pattern of technological and industry disruption time after time again. The leaders lock in market share growth. The laggards lose market share or even fade away. So let's commit collectively to back ourselves and the smarts of our teams and take the leadership actions necessary to make sure that the promise of Glasgow becomes the delivery momentum in Sharm el-Sheikh, so that this really is the decade, not of talking about promises, but of the hard lessons and the hard yards of running the race to zero at pace. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think all I have to say is a huge thank you to Nigel, to Irene, to the whole high-level climate champions team, the WEF Tropical Forest Alliance, DEFRA, and the Finance and Deforestation Advisory Group, Club of Rome, Global Commons Alliance. But essentially, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to all of you for joining. And let us drive that leadership and courage, because we can choose whichever quote we want of our inspirational leaders from the past, but let's go with Nelson Mandela this time, which is the classic one of everything seems impossible until it's done. And we're the ones who created this system, so we can change it. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Well done.